agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Joining me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
I'm good. Just enjoying my Saturday.
Glad to hear it. So, I wanted to mention before we get started, we were thinking about doing a feature on the show, kind of an unusual type of thing, and we need your help, folks. Basically, it's this idea of what things you think we believe and we're wrong about. And the idea behind this is oftentimes what we find is that we misappropriate beliefs, or at least straw man versions of beliefs, to other folks. And sometimes by just hearing from others what they think we believe and why it's wrong, we can sort of correct some issues that maybe have us talking past each other in cases. And we thought it would be an interesting thing to do. And so we're just asking you, if there are things that you think we believe and we're wrong about, we'd like to hear from you about those, and then we'll talk about them on an upcoming show. And so if you're interested in doing that, you can just email us at mail@politicsguys.com, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. We want to thank our newest supporter, Rebecca, and also a very generous longtime friend of the show who asked to remain anonymous, but who give us some, as I said, generous support. So you know who you are, and I just want to reiterate my thanks for all you've done for the Politics Guys. Thanks very much. And of course, as a supporter, you get access to ad-free versions of all of our shows. So once you become a supporter, you don't hear this, for instance, and of course, there's that full-length bonus show every single week. And that's supporters only, as well as various other things at different levels of support. And to check all that out, you can just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And, sometimes a monthly support pledge is just too much of a commitment. Well, you can support us also through PayPal. You'll find a support link at politicsguys.com/support. And we also include these links always in our show notes. And finally, we want to make sure that lack of the ability to support the show is never an impediment to you getting all the content we put out there, especially during these very tough times. So if you're in a situation where you can't afford to support the show, but you'd like the bonus content, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I am happy to get you set up with access to all the content that we're putting out. Okay, Kristen, so where are we starting today?
Well, we're obviously starting off with everything that's sort of come in the aftermath of George Floyd's death over Memorial Day weekend. And of course, there are a lot of sort of tangent issues and issues that are directly related that we definitely need to discuss, and some new things that have come up this week. So without further ado, I guess we'll start there.
All right.
The nation is still reeling from the aftermath of George Floyd's death over Memorial Day weekend in Minneapolis, and things have stayed tense, to say the least. So while activists in parts of the country are still showing a commitment to peaceful protests and organized gatherings to raise awareness for police misconduct and brutality, in some other cities, they are dealing with protests that have escalated into violence, rioting, and looting. And of course, there are lots of other topics to discuss along with this, which is something I mentioned. There's a defund the police movement that seems to have swept sort of the left-wing part of the Democratic Party. And of course, where Biden and Trump stand on all of this. There's also sort of an interesting situation evolving minute by minute in Seattle as groups and protesters establish the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which is being called Chaz. Several statues have been demolished and downed. There are calls to rename military bases. There are also some cancellations of some high-profile TV shows that came down the pipe this week. And sort of behind all of it, if you really pay attention to what's going on in Washington, D.C., there's so much going on all over the country, but behind all of it, there are efforts on both the right and the left to propose legislation that will address different aspects of policing and would, presumably overhaul the way that police officers do their jobs every day. Democrats have unveiled the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, And of course, Republicans are working on their own legislation. They've expressed some concern that the initial efforts by Democrats was not bipartisan. And there's this, this wish to work together. It's an area where Republicans and Democrats can work together. And so they're hoping for some bipartisan support on some of these issues. So, so we have a lot to talk about. Where to begin, Mike?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking, like you, like everyone, a lot about this. And, I guess where I would like to begin is by taking maybe a couple of big steps back. And I understand that's very difficult. It's a lot easier for, say, like a comfortable white male like me. But I think it can be helpful. And what I mean by this is to step back and say, well, what do we need to be in place for a well-functioning organization, whether it's police or otherwise? Because I think almost everyone there now. I should take a step back from that and say that most people agree that there are systemic problems in policing in America. Now, some people will say that they're racially focused. Other people will say that they're not. Putting that aside, we have I'm sure, differing views on that. Most people would admit, I think, maybe not Donald Trump, but that it's more than just, well, we have a few bad apples. I don't think the few bad apples view of things is really all that viable. And I think there's bipartisan agreement that something needs to happen with policing. And that's why, House Democrats and Senate Republicans are both working on plans. So I think you would agree with that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So
you won't. Yep.
So if we start from there, I've been thinking a lot about, well, what do we need to have better policing? And just keep it in that sort of non-racially tinged way, even though I think there are major racial components. And it seems to me that you need three things. Number one, you need a clear, well-defined mission that's not overly broad and not unrealistic. And again, this is for any organization. Number two, you need the right people in place to advance, to kind of try to reach that mission. And then number three, you need the right incentives to ensure that people keep their focus on that mission and not go off and do other things that aren't related to it. And it seems to me that when we look at policing in America, in many instances, that we have problems with all three of these components. Take the first one, for instance. There's been a movement that I think it's a little more of a libertarian-based thing, not the defund, but what's been called the unbundling movement, right? And the argument here is that the mission of police is just simply way too broad. They're traffic patrollers, they're social workers, they're tax collectors by building revenues for speed traps and other things like issuing citations. They're these street warriors type of thing. And it's just asking any one organization to do too much. And, I think at least that's something that we should consider. And I was kind of curious what you thought about that. Because of course, if you have a mission where you're trying to do a dozen different things that are all over the place, it's going to be tough to be an effective organization, no matter what people and incentives you have. So what do you think, Kristen? Is the mission of police in America writ large, is it too broad? Should they be doing less?
So it's funny that this is the first thing you brought up, because this was actually, I took a bunch of notes. I was sort of, picking my own brain last night and trying to figure out, reading articles, trying to figure out where I stood on some of these finer points, because I think we all, agree on some very basic premises, with everything going on. But, where do I stand in terms of moving forward? Because if there's anything we do discuss, and I think we do well on this show, it's, what solutions, where can we work together? What solutions can we propose moving forward? And I'd actually written down libertarian solution up at the top of the paper, and I'm staring at it now. I am not a libertarian. I'm a Republican, but I have some, I've said on the show before, I have some definite libertarian leanings. And one of the areas that I tend to sort of lean in sort of the libertarian camp for is this idea of unbundling. I think that's a really good way to describe it, sort of untangling messes, in terms of, budgets being bloated and really police being overworked. I have a lot of friends who are, members of law enforcement, different agencies, DEA, police, federal agents, whatever. And this is something that a lot of those law enforcement officials and a lot of people involved in law enforcement for many decades, this is sort of a sentiment that they share, is that they're doing too many things. So I would agree with you there. The issue that I have that seems to be coming up this week, and this was the second thing I'd written down, is there seems to be sort of this issue of conflating defunding the police with restructuring the police or promoting reforms. And it's funny because I was looking at several articles last night, and especially on the left, there's a sentiment that defunding, to some sort of people more on the left wing of the Democratic Party, it would mean completely abolishing the police. And I think most people, poll after poll says most people wouldn't support this. I don't support it. I don't know where you stand on it. I definitely don't support something like that. But, a lot of people bring up these situations like what happened in Camden, New Jersey, where, they're sort of conflating defunding with restructuring. The police weren't abolished in Camden, New Jersey 5 or 6 years. I think it was in 2012. They actually just restructured the department to sort of root out corruption, and it was successful. So, I think, you have all of these different programs that are tremendously helpful. But defunding the police would get rid of those programs, things like Explorer programs, school resource officers, outreach, especially in underprivileged communities and communities where there are children living in terrible situations. And so, the police do a lot of good, but there is a lot of corruption. And I think it's really tone deaf for anybody to say that it's not there, and that there is, to some extent, a lot of it is racially motivated. Again, I think it's really tone deaf to say that doesn't exist too. So I would definitely argue that this idea of unbundling, untangling, this, the breadth of what police do would be really, really important moving forward. And I would also argue for reforms and restructuring over something like defunding. Something I'm adamantly opposed to is defunding the police, but restructuring and reforming is sort of where I stand on this.
And I think that's a great, but I have a little more skepticism about unbundling than maybe some libertarians do. But I do think, though, that at the very least, making it clear what the various aspects of the mission are, and not just sort of having it all be a big blur, is very important. So it's, like I said, it's not just, you can have a broad mission if it is very well defined and everyone understands the priorities within that mission and that sort of, and I think there's an issue with that, certainly. And that you mentioned the defunding thing, and my sense of it is that what the defunding advocates are arguing for the most part, and there are some certain, people on the far left who I don't think are representative in general of liberal thought, but that they want to see money that traditionally goes to police to go to the sort of social services and supports that would make crime less likely to occur in the first place. And I'm all for that, but I don't think that should happen at the expense of policing. I would like to see upfunding for social services, but not necessarily defunding for police. And that gets into that second point about the right people. And I really feel that one of the big problems we have is what we ask police to do. There's this sort of, they're sort of like this weird combination of warrior social worker, if you will, and if you
a good description,
because think about it, we want people as police. We need people as police who are unafraid of conflict, who are okay with very difficult, stressful, conflictual situations. That's a certain personality type. But we also want people who are very diplomatic and skilled at de-escalating conflictual situations. And for the most part, that's a different personality type. Trying to find people who can combine both of those qualities is a tricky thing. And I think what happens is the sort of warrior part of it tends to win out over the kind of wimpy social services orientation. And we see that, I think, in the culture of policing from academies on. And I get that. But I think if we are going to ask the police to do these roles, and I think it's inevitable because, the police deal with a lot of people who are in dire straits and have mental health issues and all this. And it's not enough to say, well, we'll just give the cops some training, a couple of sessions. And all of us who are in any kind of a corporate business, whatever, working for the man in any way, know what most of those sessions are like. You roll your eyes. It's so easy to game the system. And a lot of people don't take them seriously. And so if we're going to ask people to do this, we need to make sure that we have people who have the right personality characteristics who are well suited to doing that. And I think what that means is things like better psychological testing before admitting people, and also changing the culture of police training. But if we're going to be doing that, we need to understand that we're going to have to compensate police officers a lot more. I mean,
yeah.
Given what they do, police officers don't really make that much. The median salary for police officers in the United States is a little bit over $60,000 a year, meaning, and folks, statistically, meaning half make more, half make less. And I use median instead of mean because it's less affected by high or low levels. That's right around where the median salary is for just general college graduates.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about the demands, the risks, the kind of unusual stresses of this job, the idea that, hey, you can get hurt or killed, on this job.
Yeah.
I don't think it's unreasonable to say, well, we're going to expect a lot more from these people. We're going to target much higher quality, not higher quality, and I shouldn't say that. We need to target people with different psychological makeups that are rarer in the population. Well, if we're looking for that, if that's what we need for the police to accomplish that mission, then we need to pay them accordingly. And that's where I agree with President Trump. And, this week he said, we're not going to defund the police. I want to see more funding for police. And I think that's absolutely right if the funding goes toward the right sort of things, especially personnel. Because if you don't have the right personnel, everything else doesn't matter. You're going to fail. And so I think getting the right people in and paying them accordingly, given what we're going to ask them to do, what we should ask them to do, that should be a top priority. And so that's what I see about the people component of it.
Well, as you were talking, I started thinking about all these arguments I've heard over the years and some of the arguments that have come up in my own home. My husband and I discuss this all the time. He's a criminal defense attorney. So, I mean, it's funny because I tell people he deals with bad cops all the time. But, we know so many good cops. So, of course, there are outliers and there are exceptions, but a lot of times some of those issues that come up in the cases he has they directly correlate with this notion that you're talking about, that maybe the culture has to change, that there are some reforms that need to happen. And as you were talking, I was thinking, wow, this argument has come up with teachers.
Yeah.
Several times. So I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the show before. I was a public school teacher for 6 years. And that's something like it was a while ago and a lot of people don't know it, but I was working on campaigns and right out of college. And as most of you, if you've ever worked on a campaign, you're only working every 2 years and the pay isn't great. And I needed something to do. And I decided I really wanted to teach. I love kids. I wanted to teach English is what I wanted to teach. And I taught debate as well. So that's what I did. In Miami-Dade public schools, I taught English and debate and I loved it. And I had a passion for it. For those 6 years, I really had a passion for it. I loved it. And there were, I came across lots of teachers who had a lot of passion. But of course, so many teachers leave their jobs, these jobs they love, the kids they love, the schools they love, because of the pay, and because of the lack of resources, and they're just sorely underfunded, and it's hard, as somebody who did this for 6 years. I'll be honest with you, it's one of the reasons I left, just because I just couldn't support myself on the salary I was making, and I've talked to people over the years who. And I think we're guilty of doing the same thing, largely in the right wing and the left wing media. With police officers, is we polarize around the good and the bad, and we don't see all the people in the middle who are doing their jobs, who are trying to get by, and who just aren't getting paid enough to do what they do. We put a lot upon teachers, and I think it's the same thing, like you mentioned with police officers. We put a lot of responsibility on them. We ask them to do a lot. And, I do think there are some fundamental problems with the culture. I think there are some notions and some ideologies that exist that should not be there. But like you said, I think it would be a fantastic idea to invest in those police officers, just like a lot of people advocate for investing in teachers. It's not so much that, the people are bad, that, there are bad teaching recruits or whatever, or teachers who don't know what they're doing, as much as you're asking them to do a lot and you're not paying them accordingly and you're not providing them with the resources. I have one friend who's a police officer, and in all of this, I was texting back and forth with him. I'm friends with his wife too, and I was talking to her too, and they were saying, in all of this, this is a good guy. He supports, his family. He's a person of color, and his heart bleeds for his community. Mine does too. I get it. But at the same time, he's like, we don't have the mental health resources. Every single day I come home angry and depressed and sad, and they just don't have it here in Broward County, Florida. They don't have those resources. If they don't have it here, they don't have it in other places either. And so I definitely would support, outreach and sort of funding these programs that give police officers the resources and the training and promote a better culture, and just to pay them more to do better and to be better. I think that's terribly, terribly important. And I hope that doesn't get lost. With the media, the way it's been, everything seems to be so polarized. You hear about the very, very good and the very, very bad. And, all these police officers in the middle, all these people in the middle are the ones you don't hear about. And those are the ones that are going home to their families every night and trying to work through all of this. They have such conflicting feelings. And, speaking to some of my friends who are in law enforcement really sort of drove that point home this week.
No, I think that's a lot of really good points you make. And one other sort of connection between police and teachers that I was actually thinking about gets into that issue of incentives, that third point that I was talking about. And that's the role of unions. For years, conservatives have said that teachers' unions are getting in the way of educating children, because teachers' unions, well, their job is not to care about students or education. Their job is to take care of teachers first and foremost. And that's not a knock on them. That's what unions do. But the same is true of police unions. Their job is not to, be concerned about the public safety or anything like that. Their job is to take care of police. And that's okay. And I'm not trying to cut on them. It's just like saying, well, what's the job of a defense attorney? To care about the disinterested pursuit of justice? No, you defend your client as best as you possibly can. And hey, the other side takes care of their case. It's the same thing with unions, but we have to recognize, I think, just like that conservatives have a point in saying that teachers' unions can get in the way of weeding out bad teachers and making it harder for us to improve teaching as schools, as institutions. The same is true of police unions and deals that they work to make it harder to identify and punish police officers who have problematic records, to say the least. And so I think, I think the same sort of logic applies. Well, what do you think?
Well, you talk about unions. I kept thinking back to when I taught. Again, I'm relying on my experience, which is obviously not everybody's experience. But when I taught in Miami-Dade public schools. And Miami-Dade public schools have a very active union. I know here in Broward we have a very active teaching union. And I actually decided not to join the union when I was teaching. I was one of the only teachers in my school who wasn't a union teacher. And one of the reasons I decided not to join was not because I don't like unions, but I feel like there are sometimes misguided attempts within individual unions to sort of better things for teachers, but in as much they allow for bad teachers to keep teaching, teachers that shouldn't be in the classroom. And I think that there are definitely some organizations that do a lot of good. I know in Broward, we recently in the last few years had some big reforms to unions. Some, some new leadership, some sort of new blood was elected, and there was quite a bit of improvement from what I understand from people I know who are on the school board and also teachers here in Broward County. In Miami-Dade, it was a little tougher. And so, I think it largely depends on the union. It largely depends on the leadership. But, I think one of the areas where I disagree with a lot of Republicans on is I don't think unions are all bad. Again, as partisan people, we tend to develop these really black and white feelings about things. And unions, that's not an exception to that. But instead of saying all unions are bad or all unions are good, maybe we work within the good unions and we try to promote some of these reforms and we try to, help police officers and recruit good police officers. And subsequently, in unions where there's, corruption or they're protecting bad cops or bad practices or whatever, perhaps we raise awareness for something like that and we try to elect better leadership. So yeah, I think it's important not to, paint over that with a broad stroke.
Yeah. And,
but I think they can be very helpful.
Yeah. And I think we need to sort of understand the ramifications. So for instance, in a typical sort of standard, whatever, industrial union, auto workers or something like that, the price that the public pays for helping to ensure that workers have better conditions and better rights and, healthcare and all that kind of stuff, that means that increases the price of that vehicle by X amount, whatever, right?
Right.
But when we're talking about, say, teachers, in some cases, teachers unions or police unions, what that can also mean is not just increasing the cost of the service, but decreasing the quality and leading to issues with, and so that's we have to weigh that sort of thing. And so you're right. I think absolutely that not all unions are the same, and we need to think about these on a sort of a case by case basis here. Absolutely. And one thing another issue that's come up a lot, and Jay and I talked about it a bit last week, and one thing that certainly seems to be a non-starter with President Trump is the issue of qualified immunity. And, and that I think is a huge issue as well. And as I read the Democrats, the House Democrats legislation, they basically would end qualified immunity. It's not really a reform. It's just essentially ending, at least as I read the legislation. And once again, I was frustrated that in all the articles that mentioned it, they didn't bother to, post a link to the legislation. But oh well, how hard could it be? Come on, New York Times, Washington Post. But I think actually that it's reasonable to have qualified immunity that still allows for good faith or sort of reasonable belief defenses, saying that if you do something and a reasonable person wouldn't necessarily think that was a wrong, against policy, what have you, well, that's okay. But the way qualified immunity is now in many places, it's just not the case. And so I think there needs to be some reform to that. But that's going to be a sticking point, it seems like. That's something that I think on the left, a lot of people just want to do away with entirely. And actually, there are some libertarians who feel the same way. Justin Amash, as I mentioned last week, who introduced a bill to do away essentially with qualified immunity. But on the right, there seems to be a very strong resistance to any sort of reform to qualified immunity, and I think that's a big problem. And I was wondering what you think about that.
So the idea of qualified immunity was something that I also found was overlooked in a lot of the reviews of the legislation that's being put forth this week, which is frustrating, because we get into the politics of all of it and we don't discuss, in the media, they sort of brush over these finer points these policy points that we should be discussing. And qualified immunity is a really interesting one because I think most people, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but most people don't fall like black or white on this one. Most people say that, qualified immunity is something that, it exists for a good reason. I think it shields a lot of these officers from being personally liable in situations where they're not personally liable, but at the same time, in issues where in situations where what they did violates this established federal law, they're exempt from it. And I think I sort of take a middle of the road approach. I sort of take that, I guess, that more tempered approach to the idea of qualified immunity. And I guess that's sort of where I stand on it. I think it's a much more rational approach. And again, policy isn't so black and white. And I really wish people would, particularly journalists, would wake up to that a little more, that most of us don't feel one way or the other.
Well, and there's a libertarian market-oriented solution that some people are arguing for this as well, and that's getting away with qualified immunity, just doing away with qualified immunity, but requiring police officers to buy essentially malpractice insurance, just like attorneys do, and then saying that, well, if you can't get insurance, then you can't work as a police officer, and then let the market figure out how that's going to be set and what the rates are, and build that into it, as opposed to having it done by the state. And I can see certainly where in the libertarian community that's very popular. And I don't necessarily, it's not necessarily the sort of thing that I would dismiss out of hand, because then that insurers would require records, disciplinary records, or else they would just say, hey, if I don't know who this cop is, there's no way I'm going to issue a policy to this officer. And so therefore that person would be stuck with that. And so that uses market incentives to improve behavior. And I think that's something that's, worth considering.
Yeah, when you were talking, I right before you mentioned that, I was thinking of that. I had read a little bit about it last night, and I talked about it with my husband because, like I said, he's a criminal defense attorney, and this was something he brought up earlier in the week. He said a lot of, sort of professional people in these, professional positions have to buy malpractice insurance, essentially. And it's an interesting solution. I'm always a fan of trying things that involve the market. I'm always a fan of trying things that sort of, how should I put this? They sort of motivate with people's wallets, because I think, there's in most cases, there's no more powerful motivator. I mean, like I was saying to my husband last night, most of us want the same things, no matter where we fall on the political scale. We want safety, we want security. We also want to make money, and most of us want to be able to keep our money, whatever that means, and do what we want with our money. And if you're a police officer, and we're dealing with these cultural shifts and all sorts of problems, within police departments, maybe that's a way to sort of incentivize better action, better training, paying attention to these changes that need to occur in these reforms. So yeah, I would absolutely support it, because I think money can be a very powerful motivator for some of these people. And also there are other things too that are involved, things like, your reputation. There has to be some measure of accountability. And if that requires, taking a hit financially, or, losing a good reputation as a police officer, I'm all for it if it would work.
Of course, one problem I should point out with that is, a lot of folks on the medical side of things would say that, well, the malpractice issue leads to the practice of defensive medicine, doing more than you might normally do because you're concerned about being sued. Well, defensive policing would be sort of a possibility, and would be just the opposite. You could see situations where police would say, you know what, I can't afford to get involved in this situation. I'm just going to turn away because God knows what it's going to do to my rates, or something like that. And of course, we wouldn't want a situation like that as well. And sometimes there can be these perverse incentives, and that could certainly be an issue with that, which is why I would not be okay with just completely ending qualified immunity, because we don't want the police to just back off and say, you know what, I'm not going to get in trouble. So if I don't do anything, or if you know what I'm saying. So I think that's a consideration, certainly. And, in a way, there was a lot in the Justice and Policing Act of 2020 that I liked, that Democrats, and I think a lot that there's going to be some bipartisan agreement on, like, for instance, banning chokeholds. I think, yeah, sure. Mandating federal law enforcement to use dash and body cams. I'm pretty sure, yeah. And providing incentives or encouragement for states and localities to do the same. Sure. It seems like there's going to be some bipartisan agreement on some sort of a national database for police misconduct. I think that's going to happen. Limiting the use of no-knock warrants. I think that's, likely to happen. Limiting transfer of military equipment to police agencies. I think that's going to happen. And also, a little more controversially, maybe giving the Department of Justice greater power to investigate bias and misconduct and providing grants to state attorneys general to do the same thing. And so I think those are all good and useful things. I think that it's going to flounder on the shores of qualified immunity. And that gets in, I think, to the politics of this, because there's a thing in policy analysis we talk about called the sort of the policy window. And Kristen, I know you're familiar with it. And basically, the policy window tends to be shut firmly during election years, especially during the 6 months leading up to it. It's pretty rare for any significant legislation to get passed right before elections. And I would say even more so now, because right now there's a pretty strong incentive for Democrats to not concede anything. Because right now, if I'm Nancy Pelosi or someone in the Democratic leadership, I'm looking at the polls, I'm looking at the economy and everything else, and I'm thinking there's a really decent probability or shot, that in 8 months' time, 6 months, 8 months' time, I guess February of 2021, we could have Joe Biden as president. We could have basically the same majority in the House, and that's all you need in the House. And we could even maybe have a majority or at least 50 in the Senate with a vice president who would be on our side to break ties. So what's our incentive to compromise with Republicans now on sort of a half a loaf thing, when by waiting 6 months, not only do we end up with more than we could have gotten otherwise, but we also have a great issue to run on, which increases our chances of getting a bigger majority and winning the election. That's a pretty strong political impetus to say, here's our stance, and we're not going to move on it. And if you don't want to come entirely over to us, then hey, pay the political consequences.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you to some extent. I definitely believe that the policy window is very, very real. And it's something I think we've talked about on this show before, how, very little actually gets done leading up to an election, because I think it's sort of one of these situations where everybody feels like they're between a rock and a hard place. They have this position, and if they make a move, especially a big sort of sweeping policy move, they risk losing voters. They risk losing people. They risk losing people in the middle, shifting one way or the other. And unless something is sort of universally popular, which I feel like in a lot of ways, a lot of what's in this legislation is bipartisan, which is why I had an issue. And I understood the arguments of a lot of, Republican leaders who said, why wasn't this a bipartisan effort? Why didn't you invite us into this? Why didn't we come together? We could have come together on this, but you didn't do that. And, the bottom line is that I understand why Democrats didn't do it, but that I don't think it makes it right. And I'm not saying that Republicans don't do it too. I think if Republicans had the ball on this one, I can't say for certain that Republicans would have invited bipartisan.
We can, because we know in the Senate that Republicans are working on their own thing and not consulting with Democrats.
No, I know. But if it sort of had been, I sort of feel like that was retaliatory in a lot of ways. When you have people like Tim Scott, you don't think so?
No, not at all. I think Mitch McConnell has zero interest in working with any Senate Democrats. No, not at all. I think there is not a single doubt in my mind that the Republicans have no interest in working with Democrats on this. No. I feel extraordinarily confident about this. This is not a Democratic intransigence thing. This is just polarized partisan politics of the 21st century. So no, but and I actually feel disappointed that the Democrats didn't go bigger on this. I would have loved to have seen, instead of maybe titles of legislation. Of course, that's a symbolic thing, but I would have loved to see something called the 21st Century Policing Act that included, tens of billions of dollars to state and local agencies to do the kind of broad sweeping reforms to really make that possible. And that I also think would be, in a way, a form of sort of relief for state and local governments because policing, that's a pretty big chunk of a lot of budgets that are hurting in a major way. So here's a way where you could have rolled in pandemic relief and policing reform, with some really strong incentives at a time when states and local governments are desperate for that money. And so in a way, I feel like it was too small and it's an opportunity missed in a way. I would have loved to have seen something just really massive. And there's the time element, of course, because basically what happened is House Democrats cobbled something together from a bunch of proposals that have been around for a long time. But I really hope that what ends up passing is much, much bigger and literally transformative for policing in America. And that's not the kind of thing you can just throw together in a couple of weeks. That's the kind of thing that takes a concerted effort, generally speaking, with the leadership of the White House and their policy team. And so my hope for this is that maybe we can get some minor reforms started in this administration. But what I hope is that there will be a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress. And just like the Obama administration made it its first order of business with the Democratic Congress to focus on healthcare reform, I would love if a Biden administration and a Democratic Congress put the same energy and effort into policing reform and basically did that sort of thing for policing reform. And that would be, in my mind, just a wonderful, a beautiful thing to have happen. So that's what I hope will end up happening.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second, because you mentioned sort of rolling out all of these big sort of sweeping changes and a big piece of legislation that brings about, did you mention like COVID relief and some of the issues related to the pandemic? Why? I guess my question would be, how would something like that ever get passed? I mean, don't you think that, or I should say, should you think that some sort of broad sweeping legislation like that covers lots of different topics that are related in some ways and unrelated in some ways? I mean, wouldn't you say that there would be a lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans, but there would be a lot of Democrats who would say that that wasn't good enough and it didn't specifically address the problems related to policing and police reform and things like that? Don't you feel like maybe they would distract from some of the issues, some of the pressing issues that are at hand and have been at hand for several years now?
Well, and let me be clear. I only meant it would be COVID relief in sort of an indirect kind of way. It wouldn't be focused, just because there's so much money that goes into policing in this country that if major structural reforms were tied to a huge inflow of federal funding, well, that would provide a greater incentive for state and local governments to say, man, we're just really suffering because of the COVID thing. Our tax revenues are way down. But if we agree to do these things, there's all this money that we can get. And that's, typically how the federal government gets state and local governments to do things, by just dangling that massive carrot of federal funding. And I like that a lot better than a stick regulatory type of approach. So, but I mean, I don't think it would have to distract from anything. I mean, I think that, certainly issues of problems with policing have been endemic for decades,
Mm-hmm.
And while policing is arguably, well, not arguably, policing, I would say, is better and less corrupt than it was, say, in the 70s or 80s, there is such a long way to go. And it takes, sadly, it takes something like this to really focus people's attention. And there's going to be a short window for this as well. And I feel almost it's a good thing in a way that it happened so close to an election, but it's not going to happen with this president. Transformative reform is not going to happen with this president. It's not, especially, and it's not going to happen with a Republican Senate led by a guy like Mitch McConnell, who basically says, you know what, we do Donald Trump's bidding, and we're not trying to convince him of anything. We're just following wherever our leader leads us, and that's what Mitch McConnell has basically said. I'm not interested in talking about advancing anything that doesn't have the president's full support, because under Mitch McConnell, the Senate is not a co-equal branch, a co-equal part of government, but it is like some sort of a parliamentary system with, Mitch McConnell apparently reporting to Donald Trump. And that's not how it should be, but that's how it is. And as long as that is how it is, we're not going to see any transformative change. That's what people want. That's what people have a right to not just expect it, but demand at this point, I think. And it's only going to happen. It's only going to happen, I believe, if we have unified party control.
I guess that sort of answers the question I had, which is the question a lot of Republicans have is why didn't this happen before under Barack Obama, or why didn't it happen during his first term, his second term? I guess I have a lot of questions about about the seriousness of this, whether this is something in the last 6 months that has sort of come up. I mean, obviously these are legitimate concerns that have been brewing for a long time, but whether we're making too much of this politically and whether this is an area where we can come together and say, okay, let's create these reforms, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, because the chances of one party, in my purview, the chances of one party sort of sweeping the Senate, sweeping the House, and then taking the presidency are pretty slim at this point.
Let me push back on that, because right now, if you look at the polls, the chances of Joe Biden becoming the next president are pretty good. Now, and it would be just counterfactual to disagree with that based on the polls. And I'm sure you would agree with me there.
Based on the polls, sure.
Okay, so there's a reasonable chance that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. Number two, there's also, looking at the polls, there's a very good chance that the Democrats will maintain control of the House of Representatives based on polling numbers and based on what we know.
I would agree with, yeah.
And then finally, if you look at the Senate polls and the fact that Republicans are defending a lot more seats, that there is a reasonable chance that we end up with a 50-50 Senate. I mean, it's certainly not a long shot at this point based on where we are with polling. And so if all three of those very possible things come together, you have a situation where if Democrats are willing to go that next step and abolish the filibuster, which they can do with a majority, then they would be able to push through, some fairly significant reforms. Now, that would require some Democratic senators who are sort of centrist to maybe make some tough decisions. But, I certainly think that there would be the pressure on them to do that. And that is what I hope the outcome is. I'm okay with the filibuster going away because I want to see that sort of transformative change. I think it's high time. And I think the reason why we didn't get it in the Obama administration is because, that was not Barack Obama's main issue. Certainly healthcare reform was, that big issue. And of course, it was on the heels of another major economic crisis. And, another thing we learned from policy is that if you're focusing on everything, you're focusing on nothing. If you're an incoming president, you basically have a shot at one, maybe two major things in your first couple of years, barring just really unusual circumstances. So the Biden, if there's going to be a Biden administration, they're going to need to decide what are the one or two things that we desperately want to do. And I think this should be top of the list. And I think if they put it top of the list and all of those very reasonably possible things happen, we can see transformative change. That's my hope. And I think this is the moment for it to happen.
Well, I guess a lot of this is premised on the fact that, that you probably put a lot of faith in these polls. I guess I don't put a lot of faith in these polls because I've been proven wrong by them more than once, way more than once. And in 2016, I felt like polling practices were really, really were deeply flawed. And really, there were only a few polls that got it right. And so, I'm not saying that the polls are getting it wrong, but I don't put a lot of faith in the practices. I'm going to wait until we get a little closer to the election to make up my mind about which polls I believe and which ones I don't believe, because I believe that, when I was in grad school, my capstone project was on implicit bias. And I think there's a lot of implicit bias going on, a lot of bias period going on within polling practices. But we shall see. I guess, and
I understand, Kristen. It's got to be tough for you to wrap your head around the idea that the Democrats could once again have unified control of government. That's tough. I had to wrap my head around it, when Trump came in. And so it's not an easy thing to do. And I have some sympathy for you there.
I'm not, it's not tough for me to wrap my head around it. What's tough for me to wrap my head around is the fact that we're being told one thing by the polls, and time again, especially recently, things have proven false. And there's such a point spread on these polls. And, I guess, what I look at is things like enthusiasm. Where is the enthusiasm? I'm not saying that I think it's wrong to say that I can't wrap my head around a Biden presidency.
Sure,
I can. I don't loathe Joe Biden. I have a lot of feelings about Joe Biden, but I don't loathe Joe Biden in terms of policy. But I do think that it's really premature to sort of make those calls right now. I said the same thing in 2016, the summer of 2016. I was convinced, that Donald Trump was not going to be the nominee just a few months prior to him becoming the nominee. And then when he became the nominee, I was convinced until election night that he was not going to win. And I was basing a lot of that on polling data that I was seeing. And I think, we're here. It's the beginning of the summer. We're sort of gearing up towards this election. There's so many X factors in place, so many more than in 2016. And between now and then, there are a million things that could happen. But I guess, I'm a little disillusioned because, I'm looking around. I see that there are these really big pressing issues that seem to come up during election years. And they seem to come up, but then they seem to subside. And that's extremely frustrating because these are legitimate concerns. I do feel for the peaceful protesters because they're, obviously the rioting, the looting is a whole other thing, but I feel for these people. These are changes that have to happen. And I guess I don't understand. I do understand and I don't understand why we can't come together and create this big bipartisan push. To me, that would be the best possible case. But again, that's sort of pie in the sky. Yeah. In an election year, that's not going to happen. These sweeping policy changes is not going to happen. And I guess I'm a little jaded. I'm not sure that whether Democrats sweep everything or Republicans sweep everything or we're split once again and there's gridlock. I'm just not convinced that some of these things that we've discussed are going to change.
Yeah,
it's disheartening. It really is.
No, and I think you're right. I am on this. I'm a little more optimistic than you're. Maybe I'm letting kind of hope kind of override my natural unfortunate cynicism.
It's not a bad thing to let hope override your natural inclination.
But yeah, and also before I know we need to move on, but before we do, yeah. I do want to point out that you make some good points about the polls. Is that a lot of them are within the margin of error, and plenty can still happen. Looking at it from a kind of a fundamentals viewpoint, we know that generally speaking, when the economy's not doing well, when people are in a situation of unrest, that tends to work to the disadvantage of the incumbent party and to the advantage of the challengers. And so we'll see if that holds. I think it will. But as you said, it's still a long ways to go before the election, and a lot can happen. Okay, so I know we're almost. I knew we were going to spend a lot of time on that. But speaking of elections, right? We did want to talk a little bit about elections, right?
Yes. Okay. So, So the next thing we wanted to talk about was actually something that happened last Tuesday. This would have been on Tuesday, June 9th. So this past Tuesday, voters in 5 states, it was Georgia, West Virginia, Nevada, North Dakota, and South Carolina, went to the polls. And the Georgia primary had actually been pushed back because of COVID. So it was sort of a makeup primary. And so I guess what we should probably focus on is almost right from the start, there were some really concerning issues that were taking place in Georgia, and mostly within the Atlanta area. While some pundits and state officials immediately cried foul and blamed COVID-19, most experts sort of noticed right away that there were overwhelming reports of issues with the state's new voting machines. And those were brought into Georgia sort of as a response to, calls of voter suppression, which were taking place in 2018. So there were lots of, I read about this story in lots of different news outlets, and 538, I thought, had the best summary of what happened. They blamed the state's ineptitude and pointed the finger at polling sites, specifically the ones in Atlanta, saying that there was no evidence of foul play necessarily, but officials were clearly unprepared for this primary using this brand new equipment. And of course, there was this back and forth between state officials and local officials. State officials were accusing local officials of being, having user error and being disorganized, and local officials were pointing at state officials and saying that there was inadequate training and the machines weren't prepared. And it was just total chaos. And while this was going on, there were some other issues going on too. In South Carolina, West Virginia, there were issues with absentee ballots going to wrong addresses. I know in Nevada there were issues of like understaffing at some of these polling locations, so it was just kind of a hot mess
Yeah.
on Tuesday. What were your takeaways from it? It kind of got eclipsed by everything else
Yeah.
going on. It's important, you know.
Well, but yeah, because I think it's we hope not a preview of November, but when
Right.
obviously turnout's going to be higher. But to me, obviously, when you put together new machines, untrained people, and fewer poll workers because of the pandemic, this was something that as you mentioned, a lot of people saw coming, but we didn't have a good way to deal with it. Except I think we did, and to me, it comes down to people again. The typical poll worker gets somewhere, and then this varies a lot, but $100, $150 or so for a day, roughly, and that's like a get there at 6 a.m. and work until the polls close, and that
I've done it. It's a long day.
This is what I'm saying, plus training, and this right now, of course, is in a very high stress environment because of all the public contact, right, during the pandemic, and so it's understandable that a lot of people, especially since so many poll workers are older folks, said, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And so what I would love to see, I think one way to really help with this, and this could still be done by Congress well in time, well, not well in time, but in time for November, is legislation that provides grants to local governments to increase poll worker training and compensation during the pandemic. This would not have to be that expensive, really. In 2016, there were roughly, around the country, 918,000 total poll workers. Now, we know that polls are almost always understaffed anyway, right, elections. So let's say we could reasonably use 1.5 million poll workers. Well, as little as, and I say as little as because this is something that Jeff Bezos could fund out of his back pocket, as little as $1 billion that's directed specifically at poll worker salary and training, that would make an enormous difference. And this could be a bipartisan thing because more well-trained workers, that means less likelihood of fraud too, makes it a lot easier to catch that sort of thing. That's what the right wants. And on the left, it means shorter lines, greater ease of access to voting. That's what the left wants. And if we can, something like that, it seems to me that's a natural bipartisan thing. And again, $1 billion at the interest rates that we can get, borrowing rates now. I mean, that this is a no-brainer to me. I think this is one of the best deals we could possibly get. And I wish someone would introduce something like this.
Well, you should definitely run for office and introduce it. No, I'm just kidding. It might be in your future.
No, I'm not a masochist.
No, me neither. That's why I'm not running. It's funny because when I was reading about this, I went back to my experience. I've been a poll worker twice, and I actually helped train poll workers in 2016 here in Broward County. So I know what a long day that is. And there is a part of me that says, like, now in 2020, looking back, I'm like, man, you can't pay me enough. Yeah. I mean, for a lot of the people who end up doing this, I'm thinking back, I knew a lot of people who did this. They were retired people, people who are living on a fixed income, and that, paltry amount of money, really, when you think about what it is that they're doing and the length of the day and the amount of the training that they have to do. And, some of the costs incurred, they have to drive their own cars. They have to go to these trainings. It's a lot of time and it's a lot of energy. And there's not a lot of incentive other than just like doing your patriotic civic duty. I remember talking to people when I was in my county's Republican Executive Committee on the board. I remember talking to people and saying, "Oh, we need poll workers," and that's a really hard sell, to people who have better things to do. Yeah. They want to show up, they want to vote, and then they want to go about their business. And, most professional people, are people who are of working age or people with young children, which was always the situation I was in. I was working, I had young kids. There's no incentive for them to take a day off work to do something like this. Why would you want to do it? And so it's not the most, attractive job, but it's a job that needs to be done. And I think, there's some truth to what you say. If we made the job somehow more attractive, if we made it easier, if we made training better, it would pretty much pay for itself in terms of eliminating headaches, because these issues seem to come up every 2 years where we're rolling out new machines, which is a good thing. They're trying to fix issues of, voter suppression and, access to voting and things like that. But, like you said, these polling sites are horribly understaffed. And and it's funny because I read a lot of op-eds that said, well, COVID-19 had nothing to do with it. I think COVID-19 had everything to do with it. It's sort of this unspoken elephant in the room, this layer on top of all of this. I mean, maybe there was a ton of ineptitude. I don't doubt that. Maybe, the state of Georgia and certainly other states had issues rolling out, absentee ballots. Maybe there were issues with training. Maybe they weren't ready. Local officials probably didn't know what they were doing. Maybe some polling sites were disorganized. But, this is one of those areas that's really great because we don't know what things are going to look like in November, coming into the election. And, are we going to be dealing with COVID-19? Will there still be some of the, social distancing and, some of these measures in place? It's confusing. Yeah. It's very confusing to look at this, but I hope, like you said, I hope it's not sort of a prediction of things to come, because it could only get worse when you increase, when everybody's voting at the same time and you're increasing the numbers of people coming in and out of these polling sites. It can really only get worse. So,
like I said, but if Congress acted now at the low bargain rate, if you could even do it for $500 million, that would make a huge difference. That would be enough time, I think, to at least be helpful. And this isn't a big technological fix. This is just hiring and compensating enough people, and this is the kind of thing that businesses do all the time. They recognize you can have the best tech in the world, but if you don't have enough people to run the factories and the assembly lines and all that, then your things are going to fall apart. And so this is a pretty, I think, not a simple fix, but it's something that's certainly well within the realm of possibility. And I know it's not going to happen, and that really just frustrates me and pisses me off. So I don't know, maybe I should call my congressman or something like that. I don't know. Steve Shabbat, if you're listening. I know we're running a little bit long, but before we go, why don't we just briefly kind of give our recommendations for the week? But I should also mention that if you want even more of us, there's so much we didn't get a chance to talk about. Like, for instance, we were going to talk about recent news. Yeah, markets and the Fed and a rise in coronavirus cases in a lot of states, and the GOP convention and Donald Trump's executive order on the International Criminal Court, and maybe even a bit about presidential power in the 21st century, some crazy ideas I have about that. So a lot, and that's going to be all there for supporters. But before we all get to that, so what is your recommendation for this week, Kristen?
Oh, I've got a good one.
Okay.
So I just finished it. It's funny because I kept trying to, there was this book that I'm sure you've had books like this where you keep picking it up and you're reading it and you just don't have time and you put it down. So I've had this book sitting on my nightstand for like 6 months, and I keep picking it up and putting it down. And I don't think I've recommended it on the show before, but I read it and then I read it again. That's how good it was. It's called Killers of the Flower Moon, and it's by David Grann. It's phenomenal. So what it is, David Grann is a journalist, but he writes like a storyteller. I think probably he's sort of capturing this wave in like enthusiasm for true crime stories and crime podcasts and shows and stuff like that. And it sort of reads like a true crime novel, but it's rooted in a lot of history. And it was something I didn't know a lot about, and I'm surprised I didn't study it more in history class. And sort of about just like this massacre of the Osage Native American people in Oklahoma, and everything that happened when oil was discovered in their land, and there were these sort of big oil barons who were leasing the land, and slowly the Osage were dying under mysterious circumstances. And really, what it sort of leads up to is the beginnings of the FBI, which is obviously a topic that really interests me. But I can't recommend this book enough. It sounds a little dry, but it's nothing like that. It reads like a story, and I was just like transfixed. And I've read it twice now.
Wow!
So yeah, that's how good I thought it was. So I highly recommend it. It has some sad parts, some funny parts, but it's just. I think it's an important read too, just because of the topic and the subject matter. It's something we don't talk a lot about Native American history, but needs to be talked about. And this is an important one. I highly recommend it.
Very cool.
What about you?
I'm going to go in such a weird direction on this. This week, I'm going to recommend a lacrosse ball. Just any lacrosse ball. It doesn't really matter. And you might say, well, I don't even play lacrosse, Mike. I say it doesn't matter. I don't know about you, but this has been a very, very stressful time for me. And one of my best friends during this stressful time has been my trusty lacrosse ball. I don't name it Wilson or anything like that or whatever lacrosse balls are named, but lacrosse balls are amazing therapy tools. It continually astonishes me how many tight and tense spots I have. And a lacrosse ball is this cheap. You can get like one for, like $6 at Amazon, even more if you buy them in bulk like I do. You roll a little bit of lacrosse ball and it's just like, wow, I had no idea that was so tight. And I feel so much better. I like them so much. I got them last Christmas. I got lacrosse balls for everyone in my department at Northern Kentucky University. It's for my Christmas present to everyone. And it's a little thing that can make an enormous difference. So if you're suffering from stress, tension, a lot of us carry it in our shoulders and neck and that. I'm weird. I carry tension in my butt. I tend to be sitting on my ass a lot. And so pretty much wherever you carry it, a little lacrosse ball, super useful tool. I'd also recommend you need a little more guidance aside from just apply it to wherever it hurts. There's something called the Trigger Point Therapy Workbook that I have found invaluable for. You would be surprised how many aches and pains, toothaches, headaches, all kinds of stuff that tends to be related to this stuff. Amazing. Probably one of the best bargains, one of the most useful things I ever picked up. And I will put links to both of those. You can find a lacrosse ball on your own, but the book you might not know is called the Trigger Point Therapy Workbook. Great thing. And we'll put that in the links. So there you go. I hope that helps everyone maybe be a little less tense as you're listening to the news and reading about, massacres of Native American populations for oil and all that. Just pull out the lacrosse ball, roll around a little bit. So yeah, but all right. So if you are interested in hearing more of us, and you're a supporter, that should be in your feed by Wednesday when we release our bonus show for everyone. If you'd like to get our bonus show and be a supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And again, please know if you can't afford to become a supporter, that's no problem. Just email me, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will give you full access. I can say that word, access to that second weekly episode. And also, if you haven't already, it really helps and it costs nothing to subscribe to the show, leave ratings and reviews, and especially sharing your favorite episodes on social media. That makes a big difference to us. And also, I should point out that I'm saying also an awful lot. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, there's our bipartisan politics subreddit, which is great. And that's at, I don't know. I don't even know the URL, but it's in our show notes. I know that. And our Facebook page, where I have recently decided I am getting back on and doing more stuff on Facebook. That's Facebook.
Good for you. I did the opposite.
Well, I kind of got
goes
pushed.
through phases.
Yeah, I got pushed off, and I said, I just don't want to deal with some of the nonsense. Then I decided, this is a forum that this is not a public forum, and I just decided that from now on, I am just going to delete any ad hominem attacks. So we are ad hominem free now on the Politics Guys Facebook group, and I think that's a cool thing, and I'm happy to provide that other forum as well for folks. And then we are also on Twitter at Politics Guys. Finally, the executive producers of our show, we really appreciate all of them. Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show is produced by us, Kristen and Mike. And we'll be back with a new show for you next week. We hope you'll join.